Marian DeWitt stood at the edge of the grave, her hands buried deep in the pockets of her wool coat, its elbows worn thin and hemmed stiff with old dirt. The sky above the cemetery was a flat and listless gray, neither threatening rain nor offering light. Just a dull weight pressing down on the hills and the backs of the few mourners who had gathered out of obligation more than affection. She did not cry. Her eyes had dried days ago, somewhere between the folding of his shirts and the careful, trembling sealing of the pine box. The preacher mumbled words she didn't really hear, something about dust, return, mercy. It all washed against her like wind through the brittle trees. She stared at the coffin as if it might shift, open, offer some final apology. But it didn't. It settled in the ground with a dull finality that felt like someone closing a door to a house that had once been hers, locking it from the inside. By the time the dirt began to fall, scooped without ceremony by the groundskeeper's shovel, the others had already begun to drift off. A neighbor woman with shawl too fine for mourning gave Marian a tight smile and touched her elbow, muttering something about soup or bread or time. Marian nodded, though she would forget the words before the woman's back turned. She remained there until the last spadeful landed and the earth was once again smoothed over with the kind of precision that pretended no one had ever disturbed it. Only when the shovel leaned against the fence and the wind picked up a sharper bite did she step away, her feet heavy in her boots, each step pulling something deep and hollow inside her. She didn't say goodbye. She had said everything already in the long silence of the nights that came before. The house had never felt so quiet. It was not that it lacked sound. There was a groan of floorboards as the wind pushed against the shutters, the rhythmic drip of the faucet she had meant to fix last winter, the occasional clatter of a loose shingle on the roof. But the absence of his voice, his breath, the scrape of a spoon against a cereal bowl in the morning, created a hollowness no noise could touch. The silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something vast and echoing, a silence that moved through the rooms like a specter. She had spent the first night after the funeral sitting in his chair, the one with the frayed arms and the imprint of his body worn deep into the cushions. She lit no candles. She did not cook. She simply sat, staring at the cold hearth, as if something might form in the ashes. They had never had children. It was a fact spoken quietly between them in their earlier years, a wound neither pressed too hard, though it hovered in their silences like smoke in a closed room. Marian had once imagined herself a mother, saw her hands shaping bread while a child tugged at her skirts, pictured lullabies sung with her cheek resting on a soft, downy head. But the months passed, then years, and the doctor had said something about timing, about nature, about waiting or maybe not waiting. Her husband, Charles, had offered comfort with the clumsiness of a man who worked with wood and iron more easily than emotion. He built her a cradle that never rocked. He said it was enough. The two of them, their quiet routines, the love they had stitched between long hours and late dinners. She had told herself it was enough too. Until now. Until he was gone and all that remained was the empty chair, the unrocked cradle stored in the attic, and the soundless rooms that echoed with what had never been. Each morning she still woke at 5, as if the muscle memory of decades refused to relent. The bed was too big, the sheets too flat on one side. She made coffee without really tasting it, the bitter heat more comfort than flavor. She stared out the window while it brewed, watching the slow procession of the world outside. The butcher's boy running late with his cap askew. The widow Hale feeding birds with a gentleness that made Marian ache. The postman always pausing to straighten the crooked sign on the general store, though it never stayed that way. Life moved in small, repetitive ways, as if the world conspired a reminder that it went on, with or without her grief. On the 5th day after the funeral, she tried to return to the market. The wooden crates of onions and bruised apples looked the same. The butcher gave her a discount she hadn't asked for, and the girl at the counter offered a smile too bright, too rehearsed, the kind given to widows and lost children. Marian bought lentils, salt, and a single roll of butter. She cooked enough for 2 that night, habit refusing to break. And when she sat down, she placed a second plate across from her without thinking. It sat untouched, the butter congealing slowly, a quiet testament to memory. She didn't clean it right away. Let it sit there like a question. The days that followed blurred at the edges. She mended socks she no longer needed, sorted through papers with names she didn't recognize, and moved from room to room as if trying to remember why any of them mattered. She found herself speaking aloud sometimes, not in madness but in instinct, a comment on the cold, a curse at a splinter, a wondering thought, directed to no one, but always ending with a taste of his name in her mouth. She avoided the attic. The cradle up there was still covering the quilt she had stitched during one of the hopeful winters, and the idea of touching it now felt like opening an old wound just to remember the pain. Sunday came. She did not attend church. Couldn't bear the way eyes would land on her, some filled with pity, others with relief that it was her turn, not theirs. Instead, she walked the outer edge of town, along the fence where the fields turned wild. The wind was sharp enough to make her eyes water, and she welcomed the sting. There was something honest about pain that came from the outside. It didn't betray her like the grief within. The sky stretched wide and unforgiving, and the ground was frozen beneath her boots. She walked until she could no longer hear the bell ringing from the chapel, until the town faded behind her, and all that remained was the steady sound of her breath and the crunch of frost underfoot. She sat on a low stone wall and pulled from her coat pocket a piece of bread. She had packed that morning without much thought. It was dry, but it gave her something to chew, something to anchor her. She thought about Charles, about the quiet way he had loved her, not with grand declarations, but with the fixing of a gate, the warming of her slippers before bed, the careful way he marked her tea with a bit of honey because he knew she'd never remember to do it herself. He had died the same way he had lived, with little fuss, little warning, just a cough that worsened over winter, a silence that grew heavier with each day until the doctor's eyes stopped meeting hers. There had been no final words, no dramatic clutching of hands, just sleep, then stillness, and a world rearranged in his absence. Grief, Marion thought, was not like drowning. Drowning was swift, panicked. This was more like sinking through silt, the light above fading slowly, the pressure mounting inch by inch until even breath became an effort. It was heavy. It clung. It whispered lies and echoed truths. And still she moved. Still she rose each day, not out of hope or purpose, but because the world had not yet given her permission to stop. That night, she lit the fire for the first time since the burial. It took 3 tries to catch, her hands trembling as she struck the match, but eventually the kindling gave way, the flame licking upward with a sound like breath. She sat in front of it, her knees pulled close, watching as the light flickered against the walls. It cast shadows that reminded her his frame in the doorway, his laugh in the dim kitchen light. She reached for the tin of old letters, notes they had passed, receipts from trips, small paper memories folded and tucked away in years when love still felt like a future, not a museum. She read until her eyes blurred, not crying, just remembering. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window panes and carrying with it the scent of pine and cold soil. Marion closed her eyes and listened to it, letting it move through her. She did not know what would come next. She did not yet know the sound that would change everything. For now, there was only the hearth, the wind, and the slow, steady pulse of a heart still beating, alone but unbroken. The morning began as so many others had since Charles was buried, quiet, cold, and without urgency. Marion rose before the sun, though she no longer had a reason to keep the old routines. The bed creaked in protest as she shifted from its warmth, her knees stiff from another night spent in the posture of waiting. She moved without haste, as if to move too quickly would draw attention from the silence that had settled around her like dust. In the kitchen, she lit the stove with a match held too long between her fingers, letting the sulfur bite into her skin before she dropped it into the flame. The kettle rattled on the burner, the sound thin and sharp, a noise that once had signaled comfort and now felt like a relic of someone else's life. She poured hot water over dried leaves, the scent rising like memory, and stood by the window, watching the world begin again. Outside, the frost had settled in a thick crust over the ground, the kind that turned grass into glass and made even the birds cautious in their movement. She watched as a stray cat crept along the fence line, its breath puffing into the air in little ghosts. The butcher's boy passed by at his usual hour, arms laden with wrapped parcels, cap pulled low against the wind. The sound of his boots crunching against the frozen road was the only sign that time was still moving forward. Marion pressed her hand against the cold window pane and counted the seconds between the steps, as if the rhythm might settle something in her chest. It was nearly noon when she left the house, the door groaning on its hinges in a way Charles had always meant to fix. She wore her husband's coat, too big but warm, and wrapped the scarf twice around her throat. The town was quieter than usual, the streets empty save for a few early risers and the distant echo of a hammer from the smithy shop. She walked without intention, her feet tracing familiar paths out of muscle memory, past the mill where her father once worked, past the old mercantile with its faded sign and leaning porch. Her breath formed clouds that drifted behind her like threads of thought, and she kept her hands buried in her pockets, shoulders hunched against the biting wind. It was near the southern edge of town that she first heard it, a sound so out of place it stopped her in her tracks. At first, she thought it was a bird, the cry high-pitched and intermittent, carried faintly on the wind. But then it came again, louder this time and unmistakably human. A child. No, more than one. The sound pulled at something visceral within her, a thread tied to an old, hollow place she had spent years stitching closed. She turned toward the old chapel on Mercy Row. Its roof partially caved and its stained glass shattered long ago by time and storms. No one used it now, not even vagrants. The air around it always seemed colder, touched by something beyond neglect. Marion approached slowly, her boots crunching over gravel and broken glass. The wind shifted and the cries became clearer. 3 distinct voices, fragile and desperate, like the sound of hunger mixed with fear. Her breath caught as she turned the corner of the chapel and saw them. 3 infants, swaddled in thin cloth and tucked haphazardly beneath the overhang, their faces red with cold and effort. They lay in an old fruit crate lined with torn flour sacks. No note, no supplies, nothing but the raw, bewildering presence of life where there should have been nothing but decay. For a long moment, Marion could not move. Her mind recoiled, tried to make sense of what her eyes were seeing. She felt her heart thud against her ribs, a dull, panicked rhythm that reminded her how long it had been since she felt anything other than numb. The smallest of the 3, a girl with a tuft of black hair stuck to her damp forehead, let out a piercing wail that cut through the cold air like a blade. That sound, that singular cry, broke whatever spell had held Marion in place. Her legs moved before her thoughts could catch up, and she was kneeling on the frozen ground, her fingers reaching out as if drawn by instinct older than reason. She touched the edge of one blanket, coarse and damp, and felt the chill radiating from the tiny body beneath. Without thinking, she stripped off her scarf, then her gloves, tucking them around the children, pressing her palms to their cheeks in a desperate attempt to give them warmth. They were impossibly small, their limbs trembling, their faces contorted with the effort of staying alive. She searched their eyes, their hands, any sign that might explain who they were, who had left them, why someone would do such a thing. But there was nothing, just the cries, just the wind, just the relentless cold. She stood, her joints stiff from kneeling, and looked around. The street was empty, the chapel long abandoned. No footprints in the snow beyond her own. Whoever had left them had done so under cover of night or before the frost had set. No one was coming back. No one was watching. She glanced toward town, then down at the children again. Her breath hitched, a sound caught between a sob and a gasp. She had nothing. No milk, no crib, not even enough firewood for another week. But she also had no choice. Something ancient and unspoken had already decided. These were her children now, not by blood, but by need. She gathered them into her arms, struggling with their weight and the awkwardness of their wrappings. 2 she cradled against her chest. The 3rd she tucked beneath her coat. Their cries lessened, muffled by the warmth of her body and the shelter of her coat, though one continued to sob quietly, the sound more tired than distressed. Marion walked as quickly as she could without jostling them, her breath coming in short bursts as the weight and fear settled into her limbs. She passed the bakery, the scent of rising dough sharp and sweet, and for a brief, disorienting moment she imagined herself walking home with her own newborns after church, neighbors waving, the smell of Sunday dinner in the air. But this was not that. This was not the story she had been promised. When she reached her doorstep, she struggled with the latch, nearly dropping one of the children as she fumbled for the key with gloveless fingers. Once inside, the cold of the house hit her like a slap. She hurried to the hearth and knelt again, placing the babies on a rug in front of the fireplace, wrapped still in her coat. She scrambled for matches, for kindling, for anything that would make fire. Her hands shook as she struck the flint, whispering desperate words under her breath. Not prayers exactly, but something close. The flame caught, weak at first, then stronger, and she fed it steadily, refusing to let it die. With the fire blazing, she turned to the children. Their cries had faded into whimpers, eyes blinking slowly in the flickering light. She touched their foreheads again, one hot, one clammy, one cold to the touch. She didn't know what to do. She had never done this. She had never bathed a baby, never soothed colic, never boiled bottles or measured formula. Her cupboards were bare. Her hands were untrained. But something had awakened in her, a sharp, pulsing sense of purpose that drowned out the fear. She rushed to the linen closet, pulling down towels, old quilts, the flannel gown Charles had worn when sick. She layered the children near the hearth, wrapping them tighter, humming a song she couldn't name. Then she boiled water and found an old jar, sterilizing it as best she could. She poured milk, weak and old, from the last of the carton in the icebox, heating it carefully, testing it on her wrist as she had once seen other women do. She found a cracked rubber nipple from a neighbor's hand-me-down box and fitted it with shaking fingers. Feeding them took hours. They refused at first, too weak or too frightened. But eventually, one latched, then another, and the sound of swallowing filled the silence like music. Marian's eyes stung as she watched them, these strange, sudden lives entrusted to her. She did not know their names. She did not know their story. But they had cried, and she had answered, and that, she thought, was enough for now. As the fire burned lower and the light dimmed to amber, Marian sat back on her heels and looked at the children, now asleep in a haphazard bundle of borrowed fabric and old grief. Her hands were red with cold and strain, her back aching from the effort, but she felt more alive than she had in weeks. There was a quietness in the room, but not the dead kind that had haunted her since Charles's passing. This silence was thick with breath, with life, with the promise of something unknown and tender. She leaned against the wall and let her eyes close, just for a moment, her body sagging with the weight of decision. Outside, the wind howled against the eaves, but it no longer sounded like emptiness. It sounded like a beginning. The crying did not stop. It filled every corner of the house, soaked into the wood of the floorboards, seeped beneath the doors, and crept into the folds of Marian's clothes. It layered itself over the ordinary sounds of her world. The tick of the mantel clock, the low hum of the fire, the creak of her own breath, until there was no moment untouched by it. The cries came in cycles, relentless and overlapping, like waves crashing against a brittle shore. One would start with a whimper that built into a wail, just as another began to settle, their needs rotating in a disjointed rhythm that mocked any hope of rest. Marian quickly lost track of the hours. The concept of day and night dissolved into a single, aching loop of motion, lifting, feeding, rocking, wiping, soothing, lifting again. In those first days, she barely ate. Her body moved out of instinct. Her stomach knotted with worry and exhaustion. The children's needs expanded faster than her resources. The tin of milk was nearly gone by the second morning, and the makeshift bottles she had cobbled together were inconsistent, their rubber nipples too worn to seal properly. She scoured the kitchen for anything that might help. Old canning jars, medicine droppers, even a spout from a watering can, until her fingers were raw from boiling and scrubbing. The floor around the hearth became a nest of blankets and bottles, scorched rags and scorched patience. The house that had once been a quiet shrine to her grief now pulsed with fragile, desperate life. The children, 2 girls and a boy, each had their own way of crying, as distinct as fingerprints. The boy's voice was hoarse and urgent, as if hunger had nested in his belly longer than the others. One of the girls, the larger of the 2, cried in rhythmic bursts, like a song stuck on a broken refrain, while the smaller one whimpered with a sound so thin Marian sometimes leaned in close just to make sure she was still breathing. The smallest, the one with the black hair and solemn eyes, barely moved when held. Her limbs curled inward like petals closed against frost. Marian took to wrapping that one in an extra layer of fabric. placing her nearest to the fire, rubbing her back gently in circles while whispering nonsense sounds she hoped might coax life back into her bones. The townsfolk did not come. Not yet. The house at the edge of town, the one with a sagging porch and smoke-blackened chimney, had never invited much traffic even in the best of times. People passed it in silence, with averted eyes or quiet speculation. Marian's solitude had long been accepted, even respected in a way that made her invisible. She had built her widowhood like a fortress. But now, inside those walls, everything had changed. The world outside continued with its rhythms. Shops opened, bells rang. Snow fell in uneven patches. But inside, Marian lived in a different universe, one dictated by the brittle rhythm of newborn breath and the soft, constant churn of necessity. On the third morning, the milk ran out entirely. Marian stood in front of the empty icebox, its hollow silence a cruel echo of the hunger now rising from the blankets behind her. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the counter, her body swaying slightly from exhaustion. There was no money. The little they had saved had gone toward the burial, and the ring, the gold band she had worn since her wedding day, was the only thing of value left in the house. She stared at it, at the thin line of pale skin beneath where it had rested for decades. It was not sentiment that kept it on her hand. It was habit. The feel of it, the weight, had become part of her. But now, it was weight she could not afford to carry. She walked to the market wrapped in layers, the ring tucked deep in her coat pocket, her steps slow and unsure. The butcher's wife looked up from her counter with a flicker of recognition, then surprise, then something unreadable. Marian did not speak at first. She simply placed the ring on the counter, her fingers resting on it for a moment before pulling away. The woman said nothing, only reached for a small tin from beneath the shelf and handed it across with quiet hands. It was enough. Not nearly enough, but Marian nodded her thanks, her voice too tight to speak. She returned home with goat's milk, her arms aching with relief, and prepared the bottles with the care of a priest preparing communion. The babies drank eagerly, their eyes fluttering closed, and for the first time since that day by the chapel, Marian allowed herself to believe they might survive. Still, the days were hard. The crying continued. The nights stretched longer than the days, and sleep came only in fractured intervals. 10 minutes by the hearth, 12 curled on a rug, one ear always listening for the next cry. Marian's body felt foreign to her, a vessel of aching limbs and dulled senses. Her hair grew matted. Her hands cracked from constant washing and handling of scalding jars. She wept once briefly, when the boy vomited an entire bottle's worth of milk across her last clean shirt, not because of the mess, but because it had taken nearly an hour to coax him to feed it all. The sound of her own sobbing startled her. It felt out of place amid the children's cries, too raw, too loud. She caught herself and bit her lip, pressing her forehead to the cold floor until the tears stopped. But there were moments, small and fleeting, when the house grew still. When all three children slept at once, their bodies arranged like a silent constellation on the quilted floor. In those moments, Marian sat close by, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the rise and fall of their chests as if the motion itself were sacred. She had named them in her mind, though she did not speak the names aloud. The boy, whose grip tightened whenever she held him, she called Elias. The larger girl, with wide, curious eyes, was Hazel. The smallest, whose breathing sometimes faltered, was June. The names had come to her without warning, drawn perhaps from half-forgotten dreams or memories of girls she once knew. They felt right. She wrote them down on scraps of paper and tucked them beneath the folds of quilt. Tiny prayers for a future that had yet to arrive. The third week brought a change. Not in the children, who still cried and fed and slept in uncertain patterns, but in Marian herself. Her movements became more deliberate, her hands steadier. She stopped waiting for rest and instead created a rhythm, a kind of order carved from the chaos. She began boiling milk at set times, folding diapers from old shirts with practiced precision. She sang while she worked. Not songs or words, but hums and half-melodies that reminded her of her mother's voice, of summer kitchens and laundry lines, and the soft hush of dusk settling over wheat fields. The children responded to the sound, their cries slowing. their eyes following her even when their bodies remained still. She talked to them, not expecting comprehension, but simply needing to fill the space with something human. She told them about the town, about the trees beyond the fence, about Charles and the way he used to whistle when he worked, about the fireflies that would come when spring returned. On one particularly cold morning, Marion found herself outside chopping wood. Her arms shook with each swing, the axe slipping slightly in her callous grip, but she did not stop. The babies needed warmth, and the firewood was nearly gone. The motion grounded her. Each strike into it sent a jolt through her spine, a reminder that her body, though tired, still worked. When she carried the logs inside, her breath fogging the air, the sight of the 3 babies sleeping in a tangled pile of cloth and limbs filled her with something unexpected. Something like pride. She had kept them alive. She, who had never mothered, never been asked to give anything more than companionship and supper, had become the one thing they could not live without. That night, as snow began to fall in earnest, Marion sat by the fire with June in her lap, her small head resting against Marion's collarbone. The flames cast soft light across the room, turning the walls to amber and her shadow into something vast. She rocked slowly, her voice low, singing a lullaby she half remembered from her childhood. Hazel stirred in her basket, letting out a soft grunt, while Elias snored gently, his arms sprawled wide. Marion looked down at the baby in her arms, at the tiny hand resting over her heart, and felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest. Not grief, not hope, something in between. A quiet understanding. A vow. She had nothing. Still no cradle. No future written in stone. No answers to where the babies had come from or who might one day come looking. But she had breath. She had purpose. And in that narrow strip of night between fear and certainty, she had chosen. She would stay. She would wake and feed and rock and soothe, and she would stitch their names into scenes of her life until no one could remember a time they hadn't been hers. The crying would continue, of course, but now it was the sound of living. And in that sound, Marion had found something like belonging. Winter deepened with a quiet ferocity, spreading itself over the town like a heavy quilt stitched from shadows and silence. The days grew shorter, the sun hanging low and brittle in the sky, barely warming the rooftops before sinking again behind the trees. Snow came in heavy spurts, and when it did not fall, it lingered, piled along fences, crusted over rooftops, clinging to window panes like frostbitten lace. The cold worked its way through the cracks of the old DeWitt house, curling beneath doors, seeping into floorboards, turning the iron of the stove brittle beneath Marion's fingers. But inside, the house no longer held the still, breathless silence of grief. It had been transformed by sound, murmurs, sighs, sleepy whimpers, the occasional sharp cry that startled even the sparrows from their perch on the frosted sill. Marion worked like a woman possessed by something greater than herself. She moved through the rooms with a quiet purpose, rising before dawn to stir the stove to life, her fingers stiff and red from the cold. She learned the quirks of the fire, where to place a log so they would burn slowly through the morning, how to dampen the flames without letting them die. She boiled water in chipped enamel pots and laid cloth diapers along the back of chairs to dry. Her body ached in new places, shoulders from lifting, hips from crouching, wrists from holding tiny limbs that flailed like soft reeds of the storm. She no longer noticed the pain. It had become part of the rhythm, the price of the work. Each cry she answered, each feeding she prepared, added weight to the invisible cord binding her to children, a thread that had begun as pity and grown quickly into something more binding, more elemental. Elias, the boy, was the first to laugh. It happened unexpectedly, one gray afternoon as Marion held him close after feeding. He was full and warm, bundled in one of Charles's old flannel shirts that she had cut and sewn into a crude sleeper. She had just begun to hum, an aimless melody with no origin, when he let out a sharp, surprising giggle, his eyes bright, his tiny fingers batting at her collar. The sound was so foreign, so joyous in contrast to the recent weeks of crying and fevered quiet, that she gasped aloud. Then, without warning, tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she held him tighter, laughing with him, not from amusement but from the staggering relief of hope. He laughed again, the sound cutting through the air like bells, and Hazel stirred beside the hearth, blinking at them both as though something had shifted in the house. Something previously unspeakable made visible. From that day forward, the rhythm softened. Not easier. Nothing about raising 3 abandoned infants in the dead of winter could be called easy, but less desperate. The babies began to stretch their limbs with more certainty, their faces slowly filling out, their eyes tracking the sound of Marion's footsteps with a trust that felt like an undeserved gift. She started to name things aloud. Milk, blanket, fire. As if by naming them she could anchor the children more firmly to the world, show them there was a place with language and comfort and consistency. They responded with gurgles, with the slow unfolding of fingers around her own, with the kind of wide-eyed watching that made her feel, for the first time in her life, necessary. She gave them the names she had whispered in her mind during those first few days of chaos and frost. She spoke them aloud now, testing the sound of them in the warm air near the fire. Hazel, for the strength in her gaze and the stubborn way she refused to be swaddled, kicking until her arms were free to flail. June, for the soft light in her eyes, the quiet way she watched the ceiling beams, as if remembering something from before. Elias, for the gravity in his silences, for the grip he had on her finger that made it impossible to pull away. The names fit. They were not grand, not biblical or poetic, but simple, rooted, like stones pressed into earth. She embroidered them, slowly and clumsily, into the edges of the cloth she used to wrap them. It was an act that felt like claiming, like stitching them into the fabric of her life. The town began to notice, but only in fragments. A neighbor passing by saw the line of cloth diapers strung above the stove and told the woman at the dry goods store, who in turn told the man who delivered kindling. Whispers grew, fed by curiosity and the strange pull of things unspoken. No one came to ask directly. Not yet, but small signs of awareness began to arrive. A jar of preserves left quietly on the steps. A pair of knitted booties folded inside a brown paper parcel with no name. Marion said nothing, did not ask where the gifts came from, did not announce the presence of the children. She did not need to. The town, in its quiet and sideways way, had begun to understand that something was happening in the house at the edge of the lane. Marion accepted the offerings with quiet gratitude. She placed the preserves on a high shelf, fed the children with the soft-spoon peaches when their appetites allowed. She washed the booties and placed them carefully on Hazel's feet, watching as the girl kicked them off again with theatrical drama. The fire never went out now. She rose in the middle of the night to stoke it, sometimes with the last of the kindling, sometimes with pieces of Charles's old furniture, chairs with wobbly legs, a stool he had carved with initials she could no longer remember. She felt no guilt burning the past. It was the present that required heat, that demanded sacrifice. And for the first time, she did not mourn what she was losing. She only feared what might come if the fire failed. Each evening, after the children had finally settled, Marion sat in the worn rocker near the window, her body aching in a way that felt more earned than punishing. She often held June in her arms, the baby still small enough to curl completely against her chest, and watched the snow drift past the glass in slow, deliberate spirals. She began to speak aloud, not in stories but in pieces of memory, as if narrating her life to someone too young to understand. She told him about her own mother, who had died too young and left behind a house full of half-finished quilts, about Charles, and how he had once carried her 3 miles home in the rain when her shoes fell apart on the way back from a harvest fair, about the apricot tree that used to grow outside the schoolhouse, and the day a teacher caught her stealing fruit from its branches. She did not expect the babies to remember these things, but speaking them aloud rooted her more firmly in the world they now shared. It was during one of these evenings that she heard the knock, soft, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. Her breath caught, and she froze, June stirring slightly in her lap. It had been weeks since anyone had come to the door. She stood, carefully settling the baby in her crib, and approached the threshold with cautious steps. When she opened the door, the wind rushed in, and with it a woman's silhouette, wrapped in a thick wool coat, a scarf pulled high over her cheeks. She did not speak at first, only held out a parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. "Extra stew," the woman said. Her voice was rough, not unkind. Marion recognized her. Mabel Townsend, a widow herself, who had once accused Marion of stealing her hymnal during a church dispute too many years ago to count. Marion reached out, her fingers brushing Mabel's as she took the parcel. "Thank you," she said, unsure whether to meet the woman's eyes or look away. Mabel nodded, eyes scanning the dim room behind her. "You've got children in there," she said. It was not a question. Marion hesitated, then nodded. "3," she said. "Found them near the chapel." Mabel's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Figures. God's got a strange sense of placement." With that, she turned and stepped back into the snow, leaving Marion standing in the doorway, the stew growing warm in her hands. She watched the figure disappear into the dimming light, her heart oddly full. It was not approval, not yet, but it was something close to understanding. The days grew slightly longer. The cries became less frantic. The house, though still drafty and patched with wear, began to feel living again, the air filled not with echoes of absence but with the weight of presence. Marion moved through it with quiet certainty, her hands never still, her thoughts always circling back to the small bodies she had come to know by scent and sound and silence. When spring came, and she knew it would, eventually, she would take them outside, show them the wild garden behind the shed, the frostbitten fence post that had once held hollyhocks. But for now, she folded another diaper, hummed a song older than memory, and let the fire warm her knees as Hazel stirred beside her and opened her eyes, dark and curious, already searching for her. And Marion, in the firelight, met that gaze with something like love, not sudden, not spoken, but slow and inevitable, the kind of love that roots itself quietly and, against all odds, begins to grow. It arrived on a Tuesday, in the middle of a slow rain that made the air heavy and the roof whisper with droplets. Marion had been up since before dawn, rising early not out of need but out of habit that had settled into her bones like a second kind of gravity. The children had all been unusually quiet that morning, their sleep deep and undisturbed, as if they too had sensed a pause in the world outside. She moved quietly through the house, lighting the stove, folding fresh linens, rinsing out the night's diapers, and laying them across the backs of chairs near the hearth. The soft patter of rain accompanied her steps, and the quiet felt almost holy in its gentleness, a rare morning without crisis or clamor. She found a letter tucked beneath the bread box while reaching for the last heel of stale loaf she'd meant to use for soup. At first, she thought it was nothing more than a scrap of old paper or a forgotten note from months ago. But as she pulled it free, the distinct stiffness of unopened parchment and the careful crease of a deliberate fold told her otherwise. Her heart stuttered. She stood still, the bread crumbling in one hand, her eyes fixed on the thin envelope in the other. It had no stamp, no name, no mark to indicate who had left it or when. The parchment was plain, folded with the precision of someone who had practiced folding their whole life. A single line of text, printed in clean, deliberate ink, ran across its center. "They are not safe. Do not give them back." That was all. No signature, no explanation, just the shape of a warning, as direct and terrifying as a scream. For a long moment, Marion didn't move. She held the letter as if it were a piece of burning coal, her fingers curling tightly around the edge, the inkless spaces between the words louder than the words themselves. She read it again, and then once more, her mind unwilling to make sense of what her eyes already knew. The children, the 3 she had taken in, named, wrapped in the old warmth of a life she thought was over, had not simply been left behind. Someone knew they were here. Someone had been watching. And worse, someone believed they might be taken. She laid the note down slowly, as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly, then backed away from the table and turned toward the room where the children still slept, unaware. June had curled onto her side in the middle of the quilted blanket Marion had patched together from Charles's old shirts. Hazel was in the far corner, her fists curled beneath her chin. Elias was closest to the hearth, one sock kicked off, his brow slightly furrowed in sleep. The sight of them, so small, so exposed, filled her with fierce, immediate heat. She dropped to her knees beside Elias and pressed a kiss to his forehead, then repeated the gesture with the girls. She lingered over June, who stirred slightly at the touch, and whispered her name as if it were a prayer. Later, When the children were awake and fussing, when bottles had been filled and tiny mouths soothed, Marion returned the letter and read it again. She folded it neatly and placed it beneath the bread box once more, unsure what else to do with a threat so quietly made. Her mind began to turn over the possibilities with the careful dread of someone who had known sudden loss before. Who could have written it? Had they meant her harm, or had they been trying to warn her of someone else? Were the children in danger from the one who had left them, or from someone who now sought to reclaim them? The question spun around her like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet burned. She began locking the door, though she knew a lock would do little to stop someone determined. She moved the cradle into her bedroom, closer to the fire and away from the windows. At night, she kept the kettle warm and the fireplace banked high, so there would be no excuse to leave the children inside. And then she did something she had not done since Charles died. She opened the drawer in the hall and removed the revolver he had kept, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tucked beside the marriage certificate they had signed in their youth. She had never liked the weight of it, never wanted it in the house, but he had insisted. "There are things in this world that won't listen to reason," he had said once, placing the revolver gently in the drawer as if it were a sacred object. "And when they come, you'll want to be heard in a different way." The revolver was cold and stiff with disuse, but the cylinder turned when she checked it. She kept it near the hearth at first, hidden behind the clock where small hands couldn't reach, and then later beneath her pillow, though it made sleep more restless than restful. Each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind against the shutters, became a possible footstep. The house she had made warm and tender with so much labor now felt fragile, exposed. The kindness of neighbors, the silent gifts, the jars of soup, the second-hand clothes, began to feel like they came with questions sewn into the seams. Who had told them? Who had noticed? Was someone already asking quietly where the babies had gone? She tried not to let her fears show, not in front of the children. She sang to them as she always did, brushed their hair with a comb she had used as a girl, whispered their names like talismans against the dark. But at night, when they were asleep and the fire burned low, her hands trembled. She thought of the path to the chapel, of the crate where she had first found them, of the terrible, blessed accident of hearing their cries. And she thought of the possibility, impossible to ignore now, that it had not been an accident at all, that someone had known she would pass that way, that someone had chosen her, and now, perhaps, had changed their mind. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch mending a sock with Hazel in her lap, a man passed on horseback. He wore a gray overcoat and carried no umbrella despite the drizzle. He slowed as he neared her gate and tipped his hat, his eyes lingering too long on the child cradled against her chest. Marion's breath hitched. She nodded politely, but her grip tightened around the needle in her hand. The man said nothing, only touched the brim of his hat again and rode on, his horse's hooves muffled by the wet earth. She did not recognize him. When she turned back to the sock, she realized she had pricked her finger. A small bead of blood welled and soaked into the wool, like ink on blotting paper. That night, she lay awake with the revolver beneath her pillow, and all three children nestled around her on the mattress she had pulled close to the hearth. Her eyes stayed fixed on the shadows that moved along the ceiling, cast by the flickering flames. She thought of Charles and how he used to lie beside her in the dark, his breath steady, his hand brushing hers in the space between sleep and waking. She imagined his voice, low and certain, telling her what to do. But there was no voice now, only the weight of three sleeping children, and a silence thick with questions she could not answer. In the days that followed, the letter haunted her more than she let on. Its presence beneath the bread box became a kind of gravitational pull, drawing her eyes each time she passed the kitchen. She did not read it again. She did not need to. Its 7 words were etched in her memory, carved like a mark beneath her skin. She began to watch the children more closely, looking for signs of illness, of harm, of memory. Did they dream of the time before? Did they remember the hands that left them behind? Sometimes June woke crying from sleep, and Mary would hold her tight against her chest, murmuring soothing words while her mind screamed questions into the darkness. The house remained untouched, and no one came. But the tension lived inside her now, threaded through her spine, coiled tight behind her ribs. It shaped her voice when she greeted neighbors. It shifted her step when she crossed the yard. It became part of her breath, of her heartbeat, of her prayers. And yet, she loved them more fiercely with each passing day. The fear did not dilute the love. It deepened it, sharpened it, turned it into something fiercely maternal and unshakable. They were hers now, not just in the way that children belong to the one who feeds them, but in the way that souls sometimes find each other by accident and choose to stay. One morning, after a particularly long night of fussing and restlessness, Marian took them outside for the first time in weeks. She bundled them tightly and carried them to the bench beneath the bare elm tree, the one Charles had built from leftover lumber after summer repairs. The sky was low and gray, but the snow had begun to melt, and patches of earth showed dark and wet beneath the thinning frost. She sat with Elias on her lap, and the girls nestled on either side, wrapped in quilts like small parcels of breath and warmth. They stared up at the sky with wide, unblinking eyes, as if seeing the world for the first time. Marian watched them in silence, her arms wrapped around their small bodies, and felt a strange calm settle into her. She could not control what might come. The world, she knew now more than ever, could shift in a breath, could take what you loved and leave you with silence. But here, in this moment, with the smell of thawing earth and the warmth of 3 small lives pressed against her chest, she felt rooted. She would protect them. She would stand in front of whatever came. She would not give them back. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of fear and memory and bone-deep fatigue, she understood something that made her eyes sting and her chest rise with a breath she hadn't known she was holding. She was no longer just a widow. She was a mother. And mothers, she knew, do not run. They stay. They choose love, even when it costs everything. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, the kind of sound that announced its own intention. Marian was in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour, shaping small biscuits from the last of the lard and the last of the patience she'd gathered that morning. The children were in the main room, scattered among quilts and handmade toys, their voices a soft background chorus of babbles and intermittent laughter. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. People didn't knock on her door, not unless they had to. The neighbors left things by the gate. The pastor had stopped coming months ago. Even the mailman had long since learned to let the box speak for itself. But the knock came again, firmer this time, and Marian's breath caught as she wiped her hands on the apron and stepped toward the door. She opened it slowly, careful to keep her body behind it. And the sight that met her eyes was not one she had prepared for. A man stood on the porch, tall and lean in a tailored coat that didn't quite suit the dust of the road or the tilt of the sky above him. His shoes were too clean, the kind that spoke of polished floors rather than muddy paths. His collar was crooked, not in a careless way, but as if he had adjusted it too many times before arriving. His hair, neatly parted and slick with effort, had begun to curl slightly in the damp air. He smiled, and Marian's stomach turned. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice too smooth, each word measured as if rehearsed. "Mrs. DeWitt, is it?" She did not answer. Her eyes narrowed slightly, hand tightening on the edge of the door. The children's laughter had gone quiet behind her. They sensed a shift in the air. The stranger, unfazed, reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a small leather folder. He held it open long enough for her to glimpse a badge and a laminated card, though she took in none of the details beyond the bold black lettering of a name she did not know. "My name is Mr. Granger," he said, closing the folder and slipping it away. "I work with the County Orphan Board." Marian did not speak. She felt the weight of the revolver in the drawer behind her, the feel of June's breath on her neck the night before as they'd slept curled together. The silence between them stretched taut as wire. The man cleared his throat and glanced past her into the dimness of the house. "I've received reports," he said, still smiling, though it didn't reach his eyes, "of children, young infants, being housed here. Now, I understand your situation. Widowhood can be a difficult time, and I commend your compassion. But if you are currently housing wards of the state without formal placement, I'm afraid we'll need to." "They're not wards," Marian said. Her voice was steady, but her heart raced like a bird behind her ribs. "They were abandoned." "Yes," Mr. Granger replied, nodding with false sympathy. "That's precisely the concern. Children left without documentation, must be processed through the appropriate channels. For their safety, of course. And yours. They were left to die, Marion said, each word clipped. They weren't put in anyone's care. No board was looking for them. No one came forward. No one wanted them. I took them in because they were cold and crying and alone. And that's commendable, he said again, the smile tightening, fraying at the edges. But the law is the law. We have systems for this. There are procedures. Marion stepped out slightly, letting the door swing wider behind her. She did not let him see past her into the house. And where do your procedures put children like that? Tell me, do you bring them to a warm home? Do they get their names sewn into blankets? Do you sit up with them through fever nights? Rock them when they scream for someone they don't remember? Because I do. I've done it every day since they were left on that corner. Mr. Granger's face flattened. The smile faded. He adjusted his collar again and glanced down at the porch boards. A moment passed, and then he looked up, and this time his tone was different. Not friendly, not rehearsed, just official. Ma'am, I'm going to have to file a report. I'll be back within the week. There will be questions, paperwork, possibly a hearing. Until then, I advise you to refrain from. Don't come back without a warrant, Marion said, and she stepped back inside and shut the door, not hard, not loud, but with the finality of someone who had decided something irrevocable. She stood there for several minutes, listening, the sound of footsteps receding, the faint creak of the gate, the silence that followed. When she was sure he was gone, she turned and found Hazel staring at her from the quilt, a wooden spoon in her mouth, her eyes wide and uncertain. Marion crossed the room and scooped her up, pressing her face into the soft warmth of the child's hair. It's all right, she whispered, though she wasn't sure it was. You're safe. I won't let anyone take you. That night, she moved all 3 children into her bed. She lined the windows with blankets, not just for warmth now, but for concealment. She turned the cradle on its side and pushed it against the front door. She rehearsed what she would say. If someone came again, if they pushed harder. She began writing letters in her head, one to the town council, one to the pastor, one to the woman who had left stew on her step just last week. She thought of calling in favors she'd never asked for, but more than anything, she thought of escape, of what it would mean to leave, to disappear, to find a road that curved away from law and suspicion and into the quiet of somewhere no one asked questions. But the thought of it exhausted her. The children had only just begun to bloom. To rip them from the roots they had put down in her home felt like another kind of death. The next morning, she began sewing again. Not mending, but making. She cut old blankets into new coats, fitted mittens from socks. If they had to run, they would not run cold. She rationed the preserves she had stored, dried apples and root vegetables, made lists of what she could carry. She remembered the old rail line that ran 5 miles north, the one Charles had taken to the city once or twice in their youth. She mapped in her head, remembered the bend in the trees where wild rose bushes grew. The thought of leaving hurt, but the thought of staying and being stripped of them hurt worse. 3 days passed before she saw another stranger. This one didn't come to the door, but she noticed him standing across the street in the early evening, smoking a cigarette, his hands buried in his coat. He wasn't from town. That much she knew by the shape of him, the way he stood. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just watched the house, as if waiting to see what it would do next. Marion watched him through a slit in the curtain, her stomach in knots. She didn't call anyone. There was no one to call. She did, however, begin speaking more freely to the children about the past, about who she was before them, about Charles, about the war that took her brother, about the day her hands first felt strong enough to lift a crying baby, without fear. She told them the truth as she knew it, that families weren't made by names on papers, but by the way a person stayed, by how they carried one another. She spoke the words into their skin, into the quilted air of their little room, as if by saying them she could write her claim into the walls. Hazel was the first to speak back. Not a full sentence, not even a full word, but a sound, a name, almost. "Ma'am," she said, pointing toward Marion with a grin smeared in applesauce. And Marion froze, the spoon in her hand trembling. June clapped, amused by the sound, and Elias made a noise of approval, a low hum that made her heart ache. "Mama," Hazel said again, clearer this time, with all the innocence of someone naming the son. That night, Marion sat by the fire and let herself weep, quiet and slow, the tears running down her cheeks without fury or shame. It was a kind of crying that came from a soul worn thin by fear, but thickened by love. She knew now that she could not run, that if they came for the children, she would not hide or beg or plead. She would stand in front of them and become whatever shape she needed to be. A wall, a flame, a storm, because love had made her into something else. Not softer, not safer, but solid. And whatever came next, warrants hearing strangers with smooth voices and crooked collars. She would meet the way she had met the children's first cries, with arms open, body braced, and a will that would not be moved. Rumors in a small town move like smoke through dry grass. Quiet at first, then swift, insistent, and impossible to stop once the flame caught. It didn't take long after the man with the crooked collar left for whispers to settle along fence posts and into pews, slipping through back porches and barbershops, passed in glances rather than voices. Marion could feel in the way people looked at her when she stepped out for flour or soap, the way conversations softened when she neared. The stares weren't overt, but they clung to her like soot, small, grimy reminders that people noticed, even when they pretended not to. The children had brought life to the quiet house at the edge of the lane, but they had also brought attention, and attention in a town that clung to propriety like scripture was often less a kindness than a sentence. It began with questions that never reached her ears. Who were they, those babies? Why had no one come forward? Was she fit to raise them? A woman alone, a widow with no blood claim? Then came the judgment spoken in the language of distance. The shopkeeper who once gave her a smile now counted her change without meeting her eyes. A woman at the well shifted her basket, placing herself between Marion and the spout, as if proximity might infect her with some unnamed transgression. The lace of gossip grew finer with each day, its threads tightening not only around Marion but around the children who had become her center. The tension did not arrive like thunder. It crept, a sideways glance at church, a door that closed just as she walked past. Then one morning, Marion found a brick lying just beneath her window pane, a jagged corner broken off, surrounded by shards of glass like frozen tears. She stared at it for a long moment, not in disbelief but in resignation, her breath fogging the morning air. She didn't touch it right away. Instead, she turned and went inside, picked up June, who had just begun to cry, held her close and warm against her chest, and hummed to her until the tears turned to hiccups. It was only then, once calm had returned to the small room, that Marion retrieved a dustpan, swept up the broken glass, and quietly nailed the window shut with strips of wood torn from the legs of an old chair. She told no one. There was no one to tell. And besides, she already knew how it would sound. An exaggeration, a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding. No one would admit to throwing it. No one would stand with her against the tide of polite discomfort. What had once been quiet support from a few neighbors, the left stew, the knitted mittens, had gone still, as if even kindness now came with consequence. She understood. People feared being pulled into the center of someone else's storm. A week passed in that way. Then a second. Marion did not flinch when she caught the pastor watching her from the chapel steps, his hands folded too tightly to be casual. She did not answer the door when the knock came from an unfamiliar hand. She stayed near the children, kept the fire going even as the woodpile dwindled, and began reading again from the old family Bible. Not from faith, exactly, but from memory, the cadence of the words something familiar to fill the silence. She had always believed in small things more than grand ones. A warm meal, a quiet room, a child's breath on her neck. She didn't need the town to agree with her. She only needed the house to stay whole. But even that seemed suddenly in question. On a Sunday morning near the end of winter, just as the snow began to thin into a watery mush, the preacher himself came knocking. Marion heard the footsteps, heavy and deliberate on the porch, and something inside her curled tight, like a ribbon drawn through a flame. She moved the children behind the curtain in the parlor, whispered to them to stay quiet, and opened the door only halfway. Reverend Alcott stood on the stoop, his black coat damp at the edges, hat in hand. He was a man made of sharp lines and deliberate pauses, his voice always careful, measured in the way of someone used to being listened to. "Mrs. DeWitt," he said with a nod. "Might I speak with you?" Marion stared at him. "If you've come to collect children, you'll need to bring a whole different sort of visitor." His expression did not shift. "I've come to ask what you mean to do." "I mean to raise them," she said. "I mean to keep them fed and warm and safe. I mean to see them into whatever future the Lord allows." The preacher's jaw tightened. "You know as well as I do, a woman alone with no kinship ties." "They're mine," she interrupted. "They've been mine since the day I heard them crying beneath the eaves of that chapel. That's not how families are made." Marion stepped outside, pulled the door closed behind her, so the children wouldn't hear. Then you never had to listen for them. You never sat through nights, so long you thought the world might end with the next cry. You never had to barter the last thing you owned just to feed someone too small to hold a spoon. Don't talk to me about how families are made. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was weighty. The preacher looked at her, truly looked, and for a moment something in his face softened. But whatever warmth flickered there was quickly doused by duty. "There will be questions," he said finally, "from the county, from the church. People want to know." "Let them ask," Marion said, "but don't come asking me to explain love." She stepped back inside and closed the door with the finality of a nail driven into wood. After that, something shifted, not in the town but in Marion. She no longer waited for judgment or comfort. She no longer walked with her head lowered, hoping to pass unnoticed. She began going to town in the afternoons. Children bundled in a wagon Charles had once used for hauling tools. She took them to the feed store, to the baker's counter, to the park at the edge of town where the grass hadn't yet remembered how to be green. She looked people in the eye when they stared. She spoke clearly when they asked questions, answering none of the ones that mattered but never flinching. Hazel had begun speaking in full words. June had learned to pull herself upright with the help of the furniture. Elias had started pointing at things, waiting for Marion to name them. She saw no reason to hide them from the world, when the world had already taken so much. One afternoon, as she passed the mill, a boy no older than 15 ran up beside her, his hair a mess of curls and his hands red with cold. He didn't say anything at first, only glanced down the wagon and then at her, and with a quick, nervous motion, he handed her a bundle of firewood bound with twine. "My pa said we had extra," he mumbled, already turning away. Marion took the bundle and nodded. "Thank you," she said, not asking who his father was. She didn't need to know. The boy didn't look back. That night, she lit the fire with those sticks, and the house warmed faster than it had in weeks. A few days later, an elderly widow from 3 houses down knocked and handed her a skein of yarn without speaking. Another time, the grocer left a jar of pickled beets on her stoop. The gestures were quiet, unspoken, and always anonymous, but Marion understood them. They were not apologies. They were acknowledgments. The town might not have chosen to stand with her openly, but some were beginning to understand. Maybe not the full shape of her life, but at least the shape of her intention. By the end of that month, Marion had become something else. Not beloved, not yet trusted, but seen. She walked into church one Sunday with June on her hip and the other 2 trailing behind, and though the pews shifted and the whispers stirred, no one asked her to leave. The preacher nodded from the pulpit, though he did not meet her eyes. After the sermon, one of the older women from the congregation, a woman who had once called Marion that rootless creature, touched her arm gently as they passed each other near the vestibule. "They look well," she said, eyes on the children. Marion didn't smile. She only nodded. "They are," she replied. The corner had not been turned, not fully. She knew there were still questions, still watchers waiting for her to fail. But the children were alive, they were growing, and they had begun to laugh with the ease of those who knew they were safe. She had not waited for permission. She had built something without it. And in that quiet defiance, in the hours spent stitching names into cloth and holding warm bodies to the tremble of fever, she had become unshakable. She was not seeking redemption. She had not asked to be seen as holy, but she had stood, unblinking, against the wind, and the town had begun to see that she would not move. The house still bore its scars, cracked windows, a door scraped raw by too many knocks. But inside, it had begun to hum with a kind of joy so steady it no longer needed to announce itself. In time, the town would forget the scandal, but it would remember the woman who stayed. It began with a cough. Faint at first, almost gentle in its rhythm, the kind that could be blamed on dust or a breeze coming to the cracked window. Marian noticed in the middle of the night, when June stirred beside her and let out a shallow, dry sound that rasped once, then quieted. She held the child against her chest, fingers moving absently across her spine, whispering soft nonsense to lull her back to sleep. But even after June settled and her breathing returned to the slow cadence of rest, Marian remained wide awake, her ears straining into the dark. She knew the sound of sickness. It had a weight to it, a texture that wrapped itself around silence and made every ordinary breath feel like question. By morning, the cough had grown deeper, and Marian knew something was wrong. June did not cry the way she usually did when hungry. Her face, always so expressive in its quiet way, seemed pale and still. She drank less milk than usual and pressed her cheek into Marian's collarbone as if it hurt to lift her head. A faint heat began to build across her forehead, and by late afternoon, her skin burned beneath Marian's hand. Marian carried her wrapped in 2 layers of blankets, rocking her gently, her own heart galloping with the kind of dread that no amount of faith or resolve could quiet. She did not speak of fear aloud, not to Hazel, who looked on wide-eyed, nor to Elias, who curled himself around Marian's leg in confusion, but it wrapped itself around every movement she made. She kept the fire hot, boiled water constantly, placed cool cloths across June's forehead, while murmuring the names of saints she had never believed in but hoped might listen anyway. It had been years since Marian had tended to illness that mattered. When Charles took sick, it crept into him slowly, stealing his breath over weeks and months until he simply failed to wake. But this was different. This was sudden, feverish, and unforgiving. She thought of the doctor, but the idea twisted her stomach. What could she say? That she had no papers? That the children were hers in every way but name? That she feared June might be taken before she even had a chance to grow into her own voice? So she stayed quiet, choosing care over risk, drawing on everything she remembered from her mother's old remedies and the hushed-tone lessons she had overheard from older women who once sat at her table. She brewed tea from dried mullein leaves, soaked towels in vinegar water, fed June broth by the spoonful even when her lips would barely part. The days blurred. June's fever burned on, relentless, and Mary began measuring time by the rise and fall of that tiny chest, the tremble of her breath. The child's eyes remained half-lidded, dark lashes resting against pale cheeks, her body growing lighter with each passing hour. Marian slept only in slivers, her body slumping beside the cradle, her hands always reaching, always touching, as if proximity might be enough to keep June tethered to this world. Outside, the snow thawed in fits and starts, the first promise of spring visible in the muddy tracks that wound through the street. But inside the house, winter still pressed against the walls, holding its breath with her. On the 3rd night, as the wind howled through the trees and rain struck the shutters like thrown gravel, June's breathing faltered. Marian had been watching her closely, but nothing prepared her for that moment. The soft hitch, the pause so long it stretched into a silence that tore through the room. Marian leaned close, her hands trembling, her voice breaking as she called June's name again and again. For one terrible second there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just a wide, echoing space of absence. And then finally a shallow, wheezing gasp. Marian pressed her forehead to the child's, tears falling freely now, her arms pulling her close in an embrace that carried the desperate weight of all the things she could not say. "Mama," a voice behind her, soft and uncertain. Marian turned to see Hazel standing barefoot near the hearth, clutching the edge of a wool blanket to her chest. Her face was round with sleep and fear, her eyes huge in the flickering firelight. "Is Junie going away?" Marian couldn't speak. Her throat was thick with grief, with exhaustion. She shook her head slowly and opened her arm to Hazel, who came and pressed herself against her side. Marian held both girls now, their bodies warm and fragile, in the quiet glow of the fire. She began to hum, not a lullaby, but something older, something made from grief and hope intertwined. A tune her mother used to hum in the dark when sickness lingered. Elias joined them, climbing into her lap without asking, and the three children rested against her, and she wrapped herself around them like a fortress made of flesh and faith. The next morning, the fever broke. It didn't leave gently. June's body shook with chills as sweat soaked her shirt, and Marion changed her clothes twice before the trembling stopped. But her eyes opened fully, and they found Marion's face, and her small lips parted in something that might have been a smile. Marion wept again then, this time in relief, holding her close as though her arms might prevent the world from ever coming near her again. The worst had passed. She had made it through. They had made it through. And Marion, in that moment, realized that something had shifted forever. Later that afternoon, Marion moved through the house with a kind of reverence. The air still carried the scent of sickness, of vinegar and smoke and damp cloth, but it also held something new, peace. She opened the windows for the first time in weeks, letting the cold spring air sweep through, lifting the curtains with its soft insistence. The children watched from their quilts as she swept the floor, wiped down the walls, scrubbed the cradle. The sun, pale but steady, warmed the wood and turned the dust into gold. Marion paused to breathe it in, to feel it on her skin, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, she allowed herself to believe that they might have a future beyond survival. That night, she dressed June in a fresh nightgown and placed her gently in the middle of the big bed. Hazel curled up on one side, Elias on the other, and Marion sat at the foot of the mattress, her eyes tracing each tiny breath, each quiet sigh. She looked down at her hands that had held fever, scraped frost from windows, stitched cloth into comfort. They bore new scars now, small cuts from broken dishes, calluses from the axe handle, the pink burn from when she spilled boiling water in the dark. They were the hands of someone who had fought to keep something alive, and they no longer trembled. The days that followed unfolded with a strange gentleness. Marion moved slowly through them, not because she was tired, though she was, but because she had begun to understand that every moment was stitched to the next by grace. June recovered more each day, color returning to her cheeks, strength to her limbs. Hazel began humming to herself again, creating songs from her imagination as she sat by the window. Elias learned to stack blocks into towers that reached almost his chin before toppling. Marion planted a small row of marigolds outside the front porch, their seeds saved from the year before, pressing them into the soft, thawed earth with June strapped to her chest. Neighbors returned in cautious, quiet ways. The old miner who once mended her porch brought her a bag of kindling and said nothing, only nodded once and left it by the steps. The widow who had once clutched her shawl closer in Marion's presence now brought a jar of bone broth and a pair of socks she had knitted in the long winter evenings. No one asked about the sickness. No one asked how close they had come, but their gestures bore the shape of understanding. Marion accepted them all with quiet thanks, her voice steady, her eyes clear. There were still dangers, of course. The memory of the letter beneath the bread box remained, folded and silent, its warning still etched in the back of Marion's mind. She had not forgotten the man with the badge or the weight of those questions that carried power behind them, but the fear no longer ruled her. Something had hardened inside her and bloomed at the same time, a resolve made not from defiance but from devotion. She would fight if she had to, yes, but more than that, she would stay. She would endure. She would keep building the life they had begun, one moment, one breath, one slow, sacred hour at a time. And so, as spring crept fully into corners of the town, Marion stood at her window and watched the world shift. The trees were beginning to bud. The river, once frozen and silent, moved again with a gentle murmur. Children ran barefoot through the street, their laughter echoing between houses. And inside her home, her three children slept peacefully in a pile of patchwork and limbs and dreams. She sat beside them, the Bible open on her lap, though she wasn't reading it, and she let herself close her eyes for a moment, not in sleep, but in thanks. She had been tested, not by any single act of cruelty or loss, but by the relentless pull of love through fear. She had stepped into the fire of illness and worry and chosen, again and again, not to turn away. And in that choosing, something new had taken root. Not safety, not certainty, but something far more powerful, belonging. The children were hers, not because no one else wanted them, but because she had stayed when it mattered, because her love had been stronger than her fear. And as June stirred in her sleep and reached blindly for Marion's hand, Marion took it and held it tightly. Spring came quietly, the way healing does, not with sudden bursts of color, but through slow accumulations. A warmer breeze through an open window, the distant song of a robin before dawn, the gentle way sunlight lingered longer across the floorboards. The house, once cloaked in grief and whispered warnings, began to breathe in rhythm with the season. Marion felt in the way her shoulders sat lower, in the sound of Hazel's steady laughter bouncing off the walls, in the way June's steps grew surer across it with slats of the floor. Elias learned to hum tunelessly while he stacked blocks, and it became his ritual, soft and constant, like the thrum of life returning to a long sleeping root. Marion had survived the fever month, not just in body, but in spirit. Something inside her had shifted in that near losing, and now, with the worst behind them, she moved through each day with a grounded quietude, a gratitude that showed itself not in speech but in devotion. She woke early to tend the garden patch beside the porch, turning over earth that had once been hard and forgotten. She planted potatoes first, then onions, then marigolds along the edges, not for harvest but for color, for beauty, for something bright to greet them each morning. The children watched her from the steps, their eyes curious and hands quick to mimic. She gave each of them a small wooden spade, carved by her own hand from old handles and worn tools. They dug alongside her, giggling when they uncovered worms, shrieking with delight when Elias found a smooth white stone he swore was a treasure. She let them believe it. Neighbors began to visit more freely, not with words of pity or questions about the past, but with offerings of simple fellowship. A jar of pickled beets left on the fence post, a length of spare cloth folded neatly and tied with twine. The boy from the mill, now taller and leaner, arrived on Saturdays to stack firewood without being asked. Marion thanked him with a warm biscuit and a nod, and he smiled as he left, saying nothing, as if their exchange had grown beyond words. The town did not apologize, not directly, but their silence softened. Their presence became less wary, more familiar. The scandal had faded. The threat had, if not vanished, been absorbed into the shape of things. By midsummer, the garden had taken root. Tomatoes clung to their vines, heavy and green. June toddled between the rows with a basket nearly her size, collecting fallen blossoms and murmuring stories to herself in a language all her own. Hazel had taken to singing, real songs now, half remembered from Marion's lullabies and transformed into her own melody. Marion sometimes caught her spinning in the yard, arms flung wide, face to the sun, her voice lifting skyward like a bird startled into flight. And Elias, ever watchful, had begun learning how to mend. He sat beside Marion in the evenings with a torn dishcloth in his lap, his small fingers mimicking hers, the thread pulling to the fabric like a line cast into a deep, still lake. Inside, the house changed too. Marion scrubbed the floors, repainted the kitchen with leftover whitewash, stitched curtains from the old linens that had once hung dry and in use at the back of her closet. She opened the windows wide each morning, even when the breeze was stubborn. She wanted the air to move through every corner, to carry away what had lingered too long. She placed fresh herbs on the sills, and the scent of rosemary and thyme filled the rooms where only ash and silence had once lived. The cradle, long outgrown, became a storage basket for toys. The revolver was returned to the drawer, wrapped in its cloth, its purpose fulfilled not in use but in presence. Peace was not a promise, but it had settled into the house like dust, ordinary, unnoticed, essential. One morning, Marion sat at the table with Elias perched beside her on a stool, Hazel at her feet coloring with a broken chalkboard slate, and June on her hip, her small hand wrapped around a strand of Marion's hair. The light from the window struck across the room in golden bars, illuminating the motes of flour in the air. Marion was kneading bread, her fingers deep in dough, the movement as familiar now as breath. Hazel hummed. Elias recited numbers aloud. June giggled as she buried her face in Marion's shoulder. And suddenly, Marion was struck with the image of Charles. How he would have loved this moment. How he would have leaned in the doorway with his crooked smile and hands still callous from the forge. She felt his absence then, not with pain, but with something like fullness, as though his love had simply spilled over and found new containers. She closed her eyes for a moment, let the warmth move through her, and whisper a thank you into the silence. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the sky turned the color of rust and soft lavender, Marian brought the children to the corner of Mercy Row. It was the first time they had returned since that cold winter morning, when she had found them bundled and crying beneath the eaves of the old chapel. She had avoided the place for a long time, not out of superstition, but because she hadn't been ready. But now, with their hands in hers, their small bodies whole and humming with life, it felt right. The chapel was still there, abandoned and sun-bleached, the roof sagging, the steps worn soft by time. The crate was gone, of course. Only weeds and memory remained. Marian knelt beside the wall where the overhang had once cast a shadow and pulled 3 small stones from her satchel. On each, she had written the name Hazel June Elias in charcoal, then sealed it with beeswax. She placed them side by side on the earth, surrounded them with marigold petals, and lit a single beeswax candle, the kind she used for the Sabbath. The flame flickered in the wind, and Marian steadied it with her hand. "These are the names that found them," she said aloud, though the children didn't fully understand. "And this is where they came from, but not where they stayed." Hazel watched the flame with solemn eyes. June sat quietly in Marian's lap, her head resting against her chest. Elias reached out and placed a single dandelion beside the stones. They stayed until the candle burned low and the first stars appeared, faint and blinking in the soft dusk. Then Marian gathered them and walked back home, her steps slow, the evening air cool against her skin. She felt something close as they crossed the threshold, a chapter sealed not by force, but by intention, a door shut gently, without bitterness, a wound that would not reopen. The seasons continued their slow arc summer brought thunderstorms, and wet laundry hung inside on string lines. Autumn crept in with crisp air and the scent of firewood. Marian taught Hazel how to make pie crust, let Elias hammer nails into a broken stool until he felt proud of the noise, showed June how to gather acorns for the windowsill. Their lives were built in these repetitions, in the daily rituals that made them a family. No longer a secret, no longer a question. Simply a truth, worn smooth by time and love. One morning in early fall, Marian stood on the porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of chicory root coffee, and watched the children chase one another through the garden. The marigolds had bloomed wildly, bright clusters of orange and gold crowding the fence line. A neighbor's child had joined them, a boy with a crooked smile, and one shoe untied, and Marian didn't mind. They played until they were breathless, collapsing in a heap beside the old bench Charles had built. The bench had aged with grace, its paint long gone, though it's soft from rain and use. She had carved their names into it with the tip of her sewing scissors. Hazel June Elias. No dates, no stories, just the names. That was enough. A wind stirred through the yard, lifting the edge of Marian's apron, scattering a handful of dried petals from the porch rail. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. It smelled of earth and fire and something clean. She was not young anymore. Her hands bore the lines of every year she had survived. Her hair had silvered at the temples, but her body still moved with purpose, and her heart still carried its own quiet rhythm, steady and full. She went back inside and pulled bread from the oven, the crust golden and split with steam. The house smelled of rosemary and yeast. The children burst through the door moments later, loud and hungry and joyful. They filled the table, their hands reaching, their stories overlapping. Marian sat among them, her own voice quiet but always heard. She no longer waited to be called mother. She simply was, in the way she moved through the room, in the way their eyes sought hers in a moment of pain or question, in the way they came to her, without thinking. And that was her legacy, not a statue, not a letter, not even a name in a book, but a house that hummed with life, a garden that bloomed where a fence once stood, and 3 children who had learned to stay. The days had begun to fold in on themselves, one into another, like laundry brought in from the line, and laid warm into basket, Creased, softened, carrying the faint scent of air and time. Marion noticed it first in the light. It changed slowly, turning from the gold of summer into something finer, thinner, a light that spread differently across the floorboards, casting longer shadows even in mid-afternoon. The trees, once heavy with their bright green fullness, now bore tinges of rust and yellow. Not yet autumn, but leaning into it. The evenings came sooner, and the mornings stayed darker just a little longer. The children still rose with the sun, or what passed the sun in those quiet weeks of early fall, their voices soft and close now, no longer the shrill cries of infancy, but the sleepy murmur of children who knew comfort and routine. Marion moved slower these days, not from pain, but from reverence. The years had gathered in her joints, stitched themselves into fold of her shoulders, softened her stride. She no longer needed to chase or rush. The children, no, not children anymore, not entirely, carried more their weight. Hazel, nearly 9 now, had learned to braid her own hair in June's too, her fingers quick and sure. She sang while she did it, low. Content songs, songs with no name but built from the fragments of lullabies Marion once hummed half asleep. June was still quieter than her siblings, but no less present. Her eyes held a steadiness, a kind of gravity that surprised Marion sometimes, as though the girl remembered more than she had lived. Elias had grown into a wiry boy with quick hands and a serious mind, always building, always watching, always wanting to know how things fit together. He had repaired the back door himself with a splintered board and 2 bent nails, and when it closed without groaning, Marion said nothing, only placed a hand on his shoulder and let the silence between them carry the pride. The house had settled into its final shape, not as it once had been, not the quiet, somber place of grief and waiting, but as something altogether different, something gently alive. The rooms had been painted in soft tones over the years. Faded greens, warm creams, lavender in the small space they called the reading nook. The fireplace had been repaired with stone Elias collected from a creek and mortared in place with too much paste and care. The kitchen table was scarred and scratched from years of elbows and dropped spoons and the clatter plates, but it was solid, still holding. It had held them all. The floorboards creaked in familiar rhythms. The garden out back had grown more than food. It now held herbs, wildflowers, and a patch of time where June liked to sit and draw the bees close with her stillness. The names Marion had carved into the old bench, Hazel, June, Elias, had faded with rain and sun, but could still be read if you knew how to look. And Marion herself, older now with hands that trembled just slightly in the mornings, had learned to sit, to be still, not from weariness, though that came too, but because the stillness was full. Her life, once hollowed by absence, had become weighty with meaning. The hours were rich with memory, not the sharp memories of pain or fear, but the softer ones, the woven kind, made of 100 small gestures, a hand on a cheek, a footstep in a hall, the sound of someone calling Mama not with need, but simply to be near her. She no longer feared what might come to take them away. The years had proven they were hers, not by law or paper, but by the way their lives had shaped around each other like water finding its course. She spent most mornings now by the window, wrapped in a shawl that Hazel had knit in mismatched yarn, watching the yard stir itself awake. Birds came first, then the wind, then the sound of June filling the kettle with water for tea. Marion had taught them all to make tea, not because it was necessary, but because it was sacred. The quiet act of warming water, of steeping something dry into something full again, reminded her at the beginning of what it meant to nurture. She had once saved lives with broth and boiled water. Now it was tea and the softness of presence. One late afternoon in October, a letter came. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the envelope bore the county seal. Marion opened it with a calm heart, unshaken by the formality. The words inside were brief, almost perfunctory, an update on a long-forgotten file, an acknowledgement of a closed case, a note that the original inquiry had been deemed unresolved and was therefore being archived. There would be no further investigation, no more inquiries. No one was coming. No one had been for some time. The children were hers, entirely, irrevocably. She sat for a long time holding that letter, not because it was surprising, but because of what it didn't change. The paper meant nothing to the children who were outside turning fallen leaves into crowns, or to the home that had already written its own truths in stained wood and soft laughter. She folded the letter, tucked it into the family Bible between the pages of Psalms, and returned to the stove where the soup had begun to simmer. That evening, Elias played the fiddle that had belonged to Charles. He had found it wrapped in cloth in the attic 2 years prior and taken to it with a quiet reverence. Now, though his skill was still uneven, he coaxed from a sound that filled the house with warmth. Hazel braided her hair by the fire. June read aloud from a worn book with illustrations so faded Marion knew them only by memory. The windows were lit with the golden softness of lamplight, and the whole house seemed to exhale, to settle around them in a hush of belonging. Marion sat in her chair, wrapped in her shawl, her feet resting on the low stool that Elias had made from scrap wood. She looked at each of them in turn and saw not the baby she had once found shivering beneath the eaves of forgotten chapel, but the people they were becoming. Hazel, kind and fierce, with hands that moved from one task to the next with ease. June, inward and luminous, as quiet as dusk and just as necessary. Elias, clever and loyal, already taller than her and protective in a way that reminded her of Charles in his best moments. They were not only her children now, they were her life's work, her proof, her echo. The fire crackled. The kettle whistled softly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the rustle of leaves and the faint memory of winter. But inside, everything held. The house hummed, not with noise, but with a kind of resonance, the sound of love not spoken but lived. It was in the creak of the floor, in the scratch of Elias's bow against the strings, in the rhythm of Hazel's breath as she leaned against the hearth, in the turning of pages as June read the words aloud even after the others had stopped listening. Marion closed her eyes, not in sleep, but in deep, contented rest. She felt her life around her, not as something that had passed, but as something still flowering. She thought of the years she had lived in that house alone, waiting for something unnamed to come and fill the empty spaces. She thought of the winter she heard crying on the corner, and followed the sound, without knowing it would change everything. She thought of the fear, the fever, the silence of judgment, the heat of protection. She thought of every small choice that had brought her here, not grand, not loud, just steady, just right. She breathed in. The air smelled of wood smoke and time. She breathed out, and with it went every last trace of wondering whether she had done enough. She had. Not perfectly, not without pain, but fully. She had stayed when others might have fled. She had given when she had nothing left. She had mothered not because she was asked to, but because she could, because she chose to, again and again. And when the children came to her side that night, tucking themselves into her warmth, their limbs draped over hers with the casual grace of those who trust without question, she did not speak. She only wrapped her arms around them and let the hush of their breathing fill the room. The fire burned low. The sky outside turned velvet and deep, and in that house, patched with memory and softened by time, Marion DeWitt, once a widow with nothing, rested in the life she had made, surrounded by the love she had grown, held in the warmth of a story that needed no ending, because some lives do not conclude. They continue quietly, in the rhythm of footfalls on floorboards, in the scent of bread rising in a warm kitchen, in the laughter that echoes long after the moment has passed. Some lives become a place, a home, a legacy, a quiet corner where crying once began and was answered fully with a name.